Today on CMS Conversations, we're going to be talking to Joshua Stacher. Josh is a professor of political science at Kent State University in Ohio. He's the author of this book, Adaptable Autocrats, Regime Power in Egypt and Syria. He's currently working on a book on Egypt's political transition after Mubarak. In 2012 and 13, he was a fellow at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. He is a regular contributor to MERIP, the magazine of the Middle East Research and Information Project. Josh, back in January of this year, you wrote a very interesting article, a prescient article in many ways, for Foreign Affairs titled, "Can a Myth Rule a Nation?" And you sort of anatomized the new Egypt, post-coup, Sisi's Egypt, if you will, although it was before the election. And you closed this article with a very interesting observation and prognosis. You say, although it might seem in control for now, the public will not tolerate an increasingly iron fist forever. Instability and violence will eat away at the myth of the omnipotent, newly promoted field marshal and the system's narrative of stability. Once that happens, the ongoing social struggle will move on to its next phase. That was a very interesting conclusion to your analysis, and I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about both halves of that equation, which is to say the iron fist, the state of state repression in Egypt today, but also what is this next phase of social struggle that you refer to?
Well, I think that looking at the process that was unleashed in 2011, I think I had a lot of respect for the historical origins of that process, because I saw them. I saw the Kafaya movement originate with my own eyes. I saw the demonstrations in 2003 against the Iraq War. And so I knew how much protesting was going on, and I was also one of the analysts that underestimated the protest activity and thought that the agency of the government and the incumbents was much greater than it was. And originally, after the demonstrations began in January of 2011 and they removed Mubarak, I had a sense that the military was going to come back and play a much bigger role than a lot of people kind of considered at the time. But I was very much focused on thinking in terms of outcomes. Like, okay, was it a revolution or not?
Right.
Was this a coup or not? And I guess that's fine for how political scientists think, but that's not how the world operates. The world operates in waves. And so we've seen waves of mobilization, and we've seen waves of counter, revolution. And I really think that what we saw over the course of Egypt's trajectory after Mubarak was dislodged was that the remnants of the reconfigured state, which was dominated by the military and tried to have a pact with the Muslim Brotherhood, was really about trying to electionize the arena and bring these revolutionary activists into elections so it could get them into state organizations so that it could control them. And that failed miserably. And
on that point, you say the Muslim Brotherhood was given a choice between siding with the revolution or the military. Brotherhood leaders broke towards the generals, believing that if they were pliant enough, they would be indispensable to the military. Obviously, things played out very differently.
Absolutely, they miscalculated. And obviously, they weren't indispensable to the generals. When the generals understood that there was going to be a potential another mobilization against Morsi, what they did is they realized they couldn't bring the revolution into the counter-revolutionary structures. They took the counter-revolution into the streets. So a lot of us were initially incredibly skeptical of Tamarud movement, and we proved right. I mean, Tamarud has come out and said, yeah, the military intelligence was basically setting us up. And so this article is really about what happens after the coup. And like a lot of people that followed Egypt, I was watching and thinking in terrible terms, like there's so much violence, there's so much killing, there's so many people being arrested, like this is so strong. And then I remembered this old quote by Hannah Arendt that said, wherever you see violence, there is no power. And I said, well, let's play with that idea a little bit. And then what I realized is like what we'd watched really was the fragmentation of the Egyptian state, and that the generals had played successive cards, and they were really getting down to their final hand, and it was all in for them. And so that's why Sisi had to run for president. They didn't have a choice. They couldn't hand it off to anybody else. And if there would be another uncontrolled mobilization, and obviously we know now that we can't predict these things, there's no telling where this thing ends up. So I don't know what the next phase looks like. I can't imagine that it's going to be wholly peaceful, because now we have this experience of the military.
But just on that point, yeah, the crackdown that you've described in some detail. But one of the things that I think a lot of us find so unnerving about the state of affairs in Egypt today is that this repressive state apparatus, the crackdown, the military, the return of the military, it's all been conducted with a sort of popular mandate. It's not like a Latin America 1970s style coup d'etat. This is something with millions of people in the streets originally. Right. Now, of course, the crackdown has begun to be directed towards some of those very people. So there's, perhaps the sands are shifting again. But the fact is that there's a lot of popular support for Sisi personally and for his state of affairs that he presides over. I
don't think Sisi's powerful at all. I think Sisi's an idea, and I think that's what people like about him. I don't think Sisi's in control of that country. The Office of Military Intelligence is in control of that country, and so in a way, what's happened is we've seen the Algerianization of that apparatus. So you have Sisi, and he is the sort of CEO of Military Inc. He's out in front, but it's not his ideas, it's not his leadership. He's consulted, he's in the room, but there's a collective body making decisions, and they were able to tap into 30 plus years of discourse against the Muslim Brotherhood, 30 plus years of discourse of being a sort of, an American sort of lackey. But the fact of the matter is they can't really deliver policies that are any different. If we look at how the military intelligence is going to do what we can expect them to do, which is basically colonize the state, take it over, and just basically make it a sort of instrument of their interests. So if you look at sort of the general intelligence services, the body that Omar Suleiman used to run, they took that over. They put one of the military intelligence heads in charge of that, while military intelligence still operating. So now they have redundant military intelligence services. But what it means is there's just less autonomy all over the place. All lines of hierarchy, all lines of chain of command are going in and out of this office. Any economic move is going to benefit the patrons of this group. And so at some point, government is still about providing goods and services. And we don't know when and we don't know where, but they can't live on this forever. And they can't kill at the pace that they have.
This actually leads to my final question, which is, you've done this kind of political sociology of the state, not only in Egypt, but also in Syria. Your book is a comparative study of both Egypt and Syria. Tell us a little bit about why you chose to look at those two countries. And you came out with this book at a very interesting moment, in the middle of the Arab uprisings, when both Egypt and Syria experienced massive popular convulsions that followed very different trajectories. Why?
I planned it like that from the very beginning. No, in the it was, I was in Cairo, and Bashar al-Assad had succeeded his father. And it looked like Imam Mubarak was going to succeed his father. And so me being a very strategic, clever PhD student, I thought, why don't I write a book that compares hereditary succession in Egypt and Syria? And then if for some reason it doesn't work, I'll explain why it didn't work in one and I did in the other.
So your base is covered.
And so when I originally went to Syria, I think I had planned to stay there about 3 months. Because I figured I lived in Egypt for a long time. I kind of knew what I was looking for. I knew how sort of Arab society worked, all the rest of the stuff.
Well, at one point, Egypt and Syria were actually one state.
Exactly, right? And so I go to Syria, And I'm not in that country 2 days. And I'm seeing such vastly different political behavior, different ways of doing things. And, every country's unique and special. But man, this was a completely different process I was seeing.
Different in what ways?
The way that the president communicated with body politic, the type of jokes that were made in sort of Syria versus Egypt. I mean,
More fear in Syria?
No, clever. More in some ways more clever. The way that dissidents would talk and people that were close to the regime would talk. You just got a sense that there were different patronage networks.
Okay, and that really gets to the question of the state structure and why did the popular uprisings in these two countries, why were they met with such different reactions from their respective regimes?
Well, this is, I think, the greatest irony of the two cases. If you would have looked at any point of time of Bashar al-Assad's presidency and any point in time of Hosni Mubarak's presidency, I mean, Mubarak was pretty much always stronger, and he always had the support of the security services and the state and the ruling party, and I mean even the opposition.
Right.
And if you go to Syria, they all supported the president as well, but they all had sort of patrons before you got to the president. So, the intelligence services would be looking to their guy, right? And I can remember people like Ghazi Kanan, who was just an absolute titan in Syria. People were more scared of Ghazi Kanan than they were Bashar al-Assad. And people like Mustafa Talas and that empire. And so, it was very clear to me that there were different ways of doing things. And then, I had some research experiences and some anecdotes kind of corroborated that showed that, people were less likely to go against, the vice president than the president in, regional command meetings at the Ba'ath Party. And so I would tease those out.
Interesting.
And so the big point is that, the irony is, in the place where the president was the weakest, he was the most indispensable for the continuation of the running of the regime.
Syria.
In Syria. And in the place where the president was strongest, he was the easiest to pop off the top.
They were able to slide him over, do away with him, but maintain the regime. This is what you call adaptable autocracy.
Right, yeah. So the whole idea behind adaptable autocrats is that, Egypt was able to respond much quicker to any sorts of crises, economic crises, political crises, than the Syrian regime, because it took so long to get consensus among anything in the Syrian regime. And so they were always going to be slower. And so when the choice was, what do we do? How do we solve this problem? Well, they band together and they fight their way out. And that started a totally different process. It was interesting at one point. The uprising started in Egypt, and I was teaching at Kent State, and I waited till spring break, and I flew to Egypt, and I landed in Cairo, and my cell phone rang, and it was my wife, and she was like, "Oh, the same thing's going on in Syria," and all I could do was just sit there and look at my book, my computer, going, "What's happened to my book?"
It was both probably a blessing and a curse. On the one hand, it made a comparativist who's got a study of Syria and Egypt. That's pretty timely. On the other hand, you know that everything's going to be out of date if you don't.
One of the great knocks against my book manuscript when it was under review and before, when I would present it on conferences, is that political scientists like to say that you don't have variation on your dependent variable. And the uprisings gave me variation on my dependent variable.
On that note, I have a lot of other questions, but we're very lucky that we have you in Denver for the next 24 hours or so, Josh.
Thank you very much.
We look forward to discussing these issues tomorrow at our conference on Egypt. Thanks so much for joining us for this interview, though.
No problem. Thanks, Danny.